Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. Welcome to the first episode of the Imagine Otherwise podcast. We kick off the podcast with our first guest, Minh-Ha T. Pham, who's an assistant professor of media studies at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. Minh-Ha is a truly interdisciplinary cultural producer, as her academic research, her public writing, and her two awesome critical fashion blogs, Of Another Fashion and Threadbare, both push for a more critical conceptual framework of fashion, particularly in relationship to racially gendered labor. She's the author of the new book, Asians Wear Clothes on the Internet, Race, Gender, and the Work of Personal Style Blogging, which is the first book ever to critically investigate the personal style blogosphere, examining the phenomenal rise of elite Asian bloggers who have made a career of posting photographs of themselves wearing clothes on the internet. Today, Minh-Ha is going to be talking with us about her new book, Fashion Bloggers of Color, and what it means to imagine otherwise. So welcome.
Thank you.
I'm excited that you're here.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
So let's just dive right in. Your fabulous new book, Asians Wear Clothes on the Internet, Race, Gender, and the Work of Personal Style Blogging, was just published by Duke University Press. So can you tell me a little bit about that book?
Yeah. Well, I think of it as a kind of adding to, but also expanding the scholarship that's already been done on Asian fashion workers. I come from an Asian American studies background, and the experience, the labor histories, and the labor conditions of Asian fashion workers are something that I studied and I know a lot about. We know, of course, that for the most part, these workers became a visible presence in fashion labor markets in around the 1970s and 80s, really the 1980s. And we know, of course, sweatshop conditions. We know that there's a lot of exploitation, there's a lot of abuse, and so on. The book that I wrote really thinks about a different group of Asian fashion workers who are actually elite. The bloggers that I'm looking at, I call super bloggers because they're really the top, not even 1%, the top 0.01% of bloggers who are actually making money, who are actually making a living, and a really handsome living at wearing clothes on the internet. So I wanted to think about how race and gender and class in this particular labor market is changing or maybe not changing in this context, in the context of digital labor, and also the context of this kind of what people are calling the new Asian decade, and for some people, the Asian century, where we're seeing parts of Asia, particularly China and Thailand, actually really rising as a global economic and commercial force. So how does race and gender and capitalism in the context of fashion, how is that creating new opportunities for rewards and work for Asian fashion workers, and in what ways are we seeing the same kinds of race and gender dynamics, and the class dynamics are totally different because, again, we're talking about an elite group. So that's the premise of the book. That's what I was really interested in, is thinking about the Asian fashion worker who is not part of the industrial manufacturing sectors, but is part of this creative, digital, informational sector.
That's fascinating. And I think those two groups never get talked about together, right? Yeah. We always get one or the other story. But kind of thinking about those two radically different class positions that are, of course, produced by each other, enabled by each other. Yeah. Thinking about those together. That's fantastic.
Yeah. We don't think about them together because for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that fashion's race problem is well documented and well known. And so when we think still about kind of fashionable bodies, we tend to think of white women's bodies, thin white women's bodies. And that's a fair assessment of the fashion industry, because that's part of its visual economy is still very much dominated by whiteness. But in this, Asian elite bloggers have this really kind of strange position because of the photographs that they're taking of themselves, right? Mostly. Of course, a lot of other people are now taking photographs of them. They've become what Alice Marwick calls micro-celebrities in a lot of ways, and in some ways even macro-celebrities, I think. We're seeing this new group of fashionable, mostly women, but not always, fashionable bodies that are not white. And I think that's still maybe something that we're not used to thinking about, even as scholars who work on fashion.
Yeah. Why fashion? Why fashion blogging? I mean, I think you make a fantastic case for the way that fashion kind of lets you trace some of these broader cultural trends. But so often fashion, both in kind of public discourse, but also in the academy, often gets dismissed, right? As frivolous, as feminized, as uninteresting, or even kind of oppressive in a patriarchal sense. So what drew you to fashion, and what drew you particularly to kind of thinking about fashion critically, but also in terms of both its pleasures and its problems?
Yeah. I'll just say at the start that one of the things, a real draw for me with fashion is that I actually just like it. I like clothes. I like shopping. I like really the art and the craft of fashion. And I say that because I think, as you just mentioned, I think the pleasure of fashion is really important to consider critically, but also as my own kind of position with regard to fashion as a scholar, right? So I think I want to say that up front. And I think it's really, when you come to your research object through that place of, admiration and love, then I think that it begs new questions, right? So it's easy, and I see this all the time, it's easy to disparage fashion because it's got a lot of problems. It's race problem, it's body imagery problem, it's class problem, it's commercial, it's crass commercialism sometimes. It's got a lot of problems, and I see all of that, but I also wanted to think about the ways in which fashion does things for people individually, but also does things in social ways that are positive, if only positive personally, right? So it makes you feel good, for example. So that's one reason I would say. The other reason that I was interested in fashion, the other more critical reason that I was interested in fashion is because it is an under-respected site of research. It's actually not an under-examined field anymore. Fashion studies is really emerging as a discipline, a discipline that you see not only in the United States but also all over the world. I go to fashion studies conferences in places like Sweden, in places like I'll be going to Austria soon. So fashion studies itself is definitely establishing. Fashion studies is now a discipline that we recognize. One of the things about fashion studies as such is that it doesn't actually. It's still not. Fashion scholars don't often have a race analysis. And I think that's really important because fashion capitalism has historically relied on immigrant labor, right? Whether that immigrant labor is Eastern European or Latino or Asian or African. And so I think that race analysis and that analysis of geopolitical power relationships are really, really important. So I feel like I want, people always say you write the book that you wanted to read. And I definitely wanted to think about fashion in terms of race, particularly, and power more generally. There are a couple of labor studies feminist labor studies that I really love. Nan Enstad's being topmost among them. But still, again, I really love her book, and it's a really important model for me in terms of my own thinking. But again, thinking about the kind of agency that NSTAD brings to the workers that she's looking at, we don't see that often with Asian fashion workers, right? Because we see them oftentimes, and they're represented in the scholarship and in popular media as victims, almost always. And so, I wanted to also think about, the elite bloggers give me an opportunity to think about their agency, because they have a lot of agency and they have a lot of power and resources, certainly more than garment workers do, fashion workers in the industrial sectors do. But I also wanted to think about how race impacts this kind of fashion work in ways that have not yet been studied or really even thought about.
I have a couple questions. This is fantastic. So the kind of idea about agency and it being really easy to identify the kind of large amount of agency and privilege that super elite, super bloggers have, makes that obviously a really great site for research. But do you see something similar playing out with agency among non-elite style bloggers? Among maybe the personal style bloggers who are part of the queer fashion blogosphere, or part of the fat positive personal style blogosphere. Do you see those same kind of tensions playing out in those contexts?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I say in the book is that these bloggers, the elite Asian super bloggers that I'm looking at, have a lot of, they're not victims by any stretch of the imagination. They have a lot of power. They have a lot of resources. Often they come from privileged backgrounds, not always, but a lot of them do. The fact that they're English speaking gives them a lot of privilege, right, in the global fashion industry, where English is really still the kind of lingua franca. So in that way, they have a lot of agency, but they are also racially scrutinized because they are they are a numerical minority in the larger blogosphere, but even in the elite blogosphere, they're a numerical minority. They just happen to be at the very top, right? And so I think that the difference between elite bloggers and, say, non-elite fashion bloggers is a difference of degrees. Non-elite fashion bloggers, particularly, if you're talking about kind of the fashion blogosphere, the modest blogosphere, et cetera, the kinds of pleasure, the kind of benefits that they get from blogging, connecting with other, like-minded people, or creating taste communities that maybe don't exist in mainstream fashion media or even mainstream fashion markets, that kind of thing. Being able to do that has real benefits that I think that bloggers, a lot of bloggers would say that they would do regardless of, whether or not they can actually make a living blogging, that those kinds of emotional and also social benefits are worth it, right? So the elite bloggers and the non-elite bloggers share that. What the non-elite bloggers don't have is the same kinds of opportunities for design collaborations or advertising collaborations or modeling, or the ways, the kind of side income streams that elite bloggers have. And it's these side income streams that allow them to actually make a living at blogging. So they don't have this. The other thing that elite bloggers and non-elite bloggers do share, though, is that they're both being, in some ways, exploited, right? So even while the elite bloggers are making, oftentimes, sometimes even six figures, they're not, the money that they're making pales in comparison to the money that they're generating, or the capital, the financial capital, but also the kind of cultural capital, the social capital, the informational capital that they're generating for the brands that they're talking about, the brands that they're blogging about. And so, and non-elite bloggers have the same kind of relationship to these brands, and also, of course, the social media platforms and softwares that they're using. They're also generating capital for tech companies, for example. elite bloggers make a little bit back. Non-elite bloggers don't, right? So I think, again, it's a matter of degree. I don't think that the elite bloggers are necessarily evading or skirting or getting around the kinds of the exploitative conditions that is actually built into blogging.
Yeah. And it also makes them both workers, right? And that's something that you highlight in the book, is this kind of performing labor as a blogger. And as you point out, even if you are a kind of elite super blogger and you make a little bit of it back, which might be, for the rest of us, a fairly large amount of money. Right. But that's labor, right? That isn't being conceptualized by the companies as labor. So they're not treated as workers and therefore don't have the kinds of rights that workers have, or at least have the ability to struggle for, right? And so because they're not marked as labor, official labor or employees, therefore they don't have access to the same kind of protections or rights that officially designated workers do. That's fantastically smart.
Yeah, no, they don't have that official labor relationship with the brands that they're talking about or blogging about, but also they aren't perceived as workers even by their readers who may love them, right? So even the most elite bloggers who are well read, have tons of traffic, are loved even, aren't seen necessarily as workers. So that their readers are used to getting to read their blog and looking at their Instagram photos, and are used to kind of seeing benefiting from their labor without paying for it, right? Because they don't recognize it as labor, right? And so if any of the bloggers were to say, okay, well, I'm going to have a subscription only blog, things would change, and they would actually be seen by their readers as opportunists, as greedy, whatever. And so, and in the book, I also talk about how some of the bloggers have complained that their readers are really demanding, and often demanding in really impolite ways, right? I don't know if you can be demanding in polite ways, but demanding in certainly, overtly impolite ways, asking for more blog posts, asking for more pictures, wondering what's happening, why, what's the slowdown in their productivity about. And so even the readers who actually enjoy and benefit from the blogs don't necessarily see them as workers. And truthfully, the bloggers themselves often don't represent themselves as workers, right? So there's a lot of, I do this for the love of fashion. I do this for the love of community. I do this for the love of connecting. Which is to say, I'm not doing it for the money, and that undercuts them. And this is true of the super bloggers and the non-elite bloggers too. Being a blogger, so much of that kind of social media world is about representing your authentic, your genuine self. And a lot of that has kind of become, in order to represent your genuine self, bloggers, and I think not just in the fashion blog sphere, but in a lot of different contexts, really, really represent themselves as artists rather than as workers. And I think that is part of, at least for the elite bloggers also, is part of their value too, right? They don't want it, especially for the Asian super bloggers, to represent yourself as a worker. You almost, you veer too close to that other Asian fashion worker, right? Which is not at all glamorous, which is not at all fashionable.
Yeah. So given these kinds of labor politics of blogging, the kind of unrecognized labor that goes into blogging, I want to actually turn to your own blogging practices, because after all, you don't just study this, you don't just kind of write books about this as a scholar, but you also maintain two blogs yourself, two critical fashion studies blogs yourself. I don't know if you would necessarily refer to them as personal style blogs. They're a little bit different, and I'd love to hear more about that. But what is it like maintaining those blogs, both the Threadbare blog that you co-author with Mimi Nguyen, as well as your other blog, Of Another Fashion, which highlights the often erased fashion histories and practices of women of color? Have you found that some of those same labor politics or tension show up in your work on those blogs?
Yeah, absolutely. to be honest, I don't actually maintain Threadbare anymore. It's been a long time since we've posted anything new. And part of that reason is Mimi was finishing her book, and she was also going to under tenure review. So, our lives changed a lot as Threadbare continued to grow. I was looking for a job for a good part of the first part of Threadbare, found a job, got on the tenure track, and had to kind of learn how to be on the tenure track. And so we haven't posted anything new in a long time. Threadbare took a lot of work, and it was all a labor of love. We did get some emails from people asking if they could post ads onto Threadbare, and we declined all of them. We weren't opposed to monetizing the blog, but we just didn't, the advertisers that we were getting just didn't work for us. So we never got paid for anything. And as Threadbare became more popular, we were posting more frequently and just more posts more frequently, which we loved. Again, we got so much out of it. We got a lot out of it together, but also just we met so many amazing people through Threadbare, including the folks from Color Lines and Hyphen. I mean, just all over the place. So it was a really great experience, but it was time consuming. And when it came down to our actual day jobs, Threadbare just took a back seat. Of Another Fashion is a little different because it's a crowdsourced. I think of it as a crowdsourced archive. So through Threadbare, I asked people to send me photographs of their families or people that they knew, women of color in the United States who were wearing really fashionable clothes, who saw themselves as fashionable people who were into fashion. Because, I really was thinking about how to, in some ways, decolonize the fashion archive, which is full of, if you go to a fashion museum, if you go to any mainstream fashion archive, you see nothing but luxury brands, and you see nothing but white women's bodies in these clothes. And so I wanted to decolonize the fashion historical imaginary and think about, women of color have been in the United States for a long time, and fashion is such a pervasive cultural force that surely they participated and they were interested in, and maybe even were fashion leaders. And so Of Another Fashion is in some ways easier to maintain because it's a group effort, it's a collective effort. And there are times when I get tons of photographs, and there's times when there's a lull. So it's not something that I have to focus on all the time. Threadbare was much more hands-on, was much more. And another thing we were doing with Threadbare is we were responding to current events that were happening in fashion. So cultural appropriation, racism, et cetera. And I think that, that becomes really tiring, where we felt like we were beholden to the kind of 24-hour media cycle, rather than, and we're both academics, so that the academic temporality is much different, right? There's time to think, there's time to draft. Threadbare is a very different kind of thing, but I loved working on Threadbare, and I often tell people that it's because of Threadbare that I actually discovered my voice and actually discovered how to be a writer, even more so than in grad school.
Fascinating. So this kind of brings me to something that I definitely want to talk about, as it's kind of the theme of the podcast, which is this braid between art, activism, and academia. And your kind of work that you produce in all these different spaces and all these different mediums is such a fantastic example of that. So why do you do that? And how do you see that kind of contributing to some kind of broader social justice project?
Yeah. I before I knew the term engaged scholarship or public scholarship, I actually think that Threadbare was already doing that. We took our training as ethnic studies students at the time, grad students. We took our training, and we try to apply it to this, these real things that were happening in the world. And in doing so, and because of Threadbare's increasing popularity, and because of folks at Jezebel and at Color Lines and other people that were really supportive of Threadbare and would syndicate some of our blog posts or even just link to it, we actually found that we were intervening in some way in the kind of mainstream popular discourse about fashion. And so all of a sudden, places like Jezebel, that's owned by Gawker, other bigger media places, were talking about race, taking race seriously in fashion, and taking class and capitalism and ideas about power seriously. And I think that we had a lot to do with that. And I don't say that very often, but I think that Threadbare had a lot to do with shifting the kind of mainstream discourse about fashion. Threadbare is a really well-known research blog on fashion, and I think we did a lot to add to the conversation and also shape the conversation. Why do I do that? I think that if I had to guess, I think that my background at Berkeley, I graduated in the comparative ethnic studies department at UC Berkeley, and that department has a strong activist history, and certainly, and I think even kind of the idea of bridging the activist scholarship divide is something that is very much a part of the culture. And so I think that my wanting to do academic work that actually mattered to people, and not just academics, that actually was thinking about, if not solving, but thinking about real problems that were happening. And fashion, again, is one of those sites that people dismiss as frivolous or as unimportant. And yet it's pervasive. It's a multi-billion-dollar global industry. It employs tons of people all over the place. Its labor conditions and so on are worth thinking about. And I just thought that I think that I wanted to make fashion better in some ways, probably because I love it, and I want it to be better. I want it to be an industry and a cultural sphere that I actually, am proud of, and I'm not always angry at it, which oftentimes I am angry at fashion a lot. And so, I think I wanted to make it better.
That's a fantastic reason.
Yeah.
That actually kind of dovetails nicely into my favorite question that I get to ask guests, which is at the kind of heart of the work you do and the heart of the work that this podcast is highlighting, which is your vision of a better world, that kind of world that you're working towards when you teach your classes, when you publish your books, when you create your blogs. There's a Dorothy Allison quote that kind of exemplifies the power of naming that kind of social justice desire that I really love. And she says, revolutions start when people look each other in the eye, say, I want, and mean it. Which is
great.
I know, isn't that powerful?
That's so great. Yeah.
So what's that world that you're working towards? What do you want?
That's such a great quote. It's also so hard to do. It takes a lot of bravery, a lot of courage to do that. I think, especially for women and women of color, where I want it's not actually what you're raised, right? It's about how do you help other people, and how do you self-sacrifice, et cetera. And so that's a really great quote. What do I want through my teaching and through my research? That's a really hard question to answer.
It's a big one, I know.
Sounding a little bit like a beauty contestant, a beauty pageant contestant. But I think that, I want a more just world. I want a fairer world for not only all people, but especially because of my background, for immigrants, for people of color, for women of color, especially for girls of color. And I think part of that is what I do in the classroom is I try to give my students, the language in which to talk about discrimination, in which to talk about power relationships, right? And also ways in which they can, to help them think about it, to help them process it. And I try to do that through my writing too. And so, how do we talk about power in a site-like fashion where power is pervasive and yet often concealed by language like, just where discourses about beauty and about craft, et cetera, sort of gloss over power. And so I think that's what I want, is just to give people, to help think through and to give people a language and a perspective and a framework to think about how to be fair, how to be more fair. And I will say that has become much more personal to me now that I have a young son. He's 2 years old, and I often think about the kind of I want, things aren't fair and life will not be fair for him, but I want things to be just a little bit more fair. I want things to be a little bit more easy for him than it has been for other people.
Yeah. That's a fantastic goal. I love that. I want that world too.
Yeah.
Are you working on any new projects, maybe stemming from some of those goals, or are you still reeling from the brand new book you just put out?
No, I'm ready. I'm ready to think about other things and to write new books. I am. I've just started writing. I'm in the very early stages of a new book project that is intervening on the debates recently about fashion copyright, and particularly, that the fashion knockoff. There's been all kinds of noise about particularly Chinese fashion knockoffs and fashion counterfeits. And so I want to think about the ways in which that debate is actually not a legal debate, because fashion design is not actually copyright protected. There are some legal protections, but they're weak and they're often ineffective. But that the ways in which we understand the kind of the common sense around what is a fashion counterfeit and what is fashion that's inspired by that kind of dialectic, that binary is actually not a legal construction, but a media construction. And I saw in the next book, I'm trying to trace how that construction came about and what it means and what the implications are in thinking about, again, race, gender, class, and power. And also the other, the other part of this trajectory is also to think about how participatory media has either helped or not helped so much these ideas about what is a creative act and what is a criminal act. So, thinking about whether or not participatory media is actually democratizing discourse or not.
Fascinating. Is that different or related to the ways that that cultural appropriation works, right? Like, it seems like those are the conversations about those two things don't tend to intersect.
Yes.
But I wonder so what is the difference, for instance, between the kind of discourse about supposed knockoffs and this kind of reification of this supposed, authenticity, the kind of aura of the supposed original, which is usually produced by a wealthy, white, usually US based or at least European based fashion designer that supposedly gets copied by somebody who's basically not that kind of body, right? And the kind of condemnation of that. And yet, so that's kind of one public discourse or debate, right? But it often doesn't seem to intersect with the kind of debates about cultural appropriation, where it's the supposed original or the authentic is coming from a space of marginality that then gets appropriated into the mainstream. So, like, how do those two things intersect? Are you looking at that at all, or is this beyond the realm of
No, absolutely. You've totally nailed it. That's exactly what I'm interested in, and why these conversations are so bifurcated. What does that mean, right? When both of them are examples of copying, but yet one copying is considered still a creative act of originality, and one is considered so when the cultural appropriation happens, and we saw this recently at the Met, right, with the Looking Glass exhibit, no one was talking about counterfeiting. Nobody was talking about knockoffs. Everybody was talking about inspiration and inspiration was sort of the key word. And yet, in other contexts, when, say, Chinese manufacturers are also inspired by European designers or American designers, they're knockoffs, right? What they're doing is rises to the level of a criminal act. So I do think about, and this is part of thinking about how did these ideas about the counterfeit, the knockoff, and the inspired by get constructed? How are these cultural constructions, right? How did this happen? When did this happen? Because copying is part of the fashion. Fashion is a copying culture. In fact, the New York fashion industry would not be anything without copying. Its rise in the early 20th century was all about copying. So when did copying become seen as a deviant thing? How did it get racialized as something that for example, Chinese manufacturers do, or the Chinese vendors on Canal Street do? When did that happen, and what does it mean about race and capitalism and authorship when white designers are copying? How does that become something that's still I talk about it a little bit as a kind of a practice of exceptionality, right? Cultural appropriation occupies a state of exceptionality because it's copying, but it's still seen as original. So how does that happen? And so those are the ideas that I'm working through in the next book.
Well, I'm excited for you to figure that out, and I'm excited to read it. But for now, where can we find you online, and where can people buy your fabulous new book, Asians Wear Clothes on the Internet?
The book is available everywhere books are available, as far as I can tell. Certainly, you can buy it at the Duke University Press website, but it's really everywhere. And I am, well, as you said, I'm at Pratt right now, so I believe I have a Pratt faculty webpage, but also I have my own personal webpage, and that's at Minh-Ha T Pham, Minh-Ha-T-Pham.strikingly.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the Imagining Otherwise podcast and telling us all kinds of fantastic stuff about kind of critical fashion histories and sharing material from your new book.
Thanks so much, Cathy. This was really fun.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Editing for this episode was done by Julie Leonard. Make sure to check out our website, imagineotherwise.com, for show notes, episodes, and links to the books, projects, and people we discuss. You can also subscribe to the Imagine Otherwise podcast on iTunes.